I owe my future to the woman who paid for my education without ever knowing it. My grandson said into the microphone, and in that moment, surrounded by applause, cameras, and proud families, I felt something cold settle in my chest. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I was 69 years old that spring afternoon, sitting in the third row of a high school football stadium outside Kansas City, watching my grandson Tyler graduate as valedictorian. The sky was bright and clear. Blue banners fluttered along the fence. Families filled the aluminum bleachers, waving signs and cheering every time a student crossed the stage. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life. For most of the ceremony, it was. Tyler had always been a remarkable young man. Smart, kind, thoughtful in ways that seemed rare these days. I had watched him grow from a curious little boy who carried books everywhere into a young man with a full scholarship and dreams bigger than our small corner of Missouri. When his name was announced, I stood with everyone else and clapped until my hands hurt. I felt proud enough to burst. Then came the speech. Tyler adjusted the microphone and smiled at the crowd. His voice was calm, confident, and warm. He thanked his teachers, his friends, his parents. The audience laughed at a few jokes and wiped away tears during the sentimental moments. I smiled the entire time. Then he reached the part that changed everything. Success isn't something you achieve alone, he said. Sometimes people help build your future without even realizing it. I owe my future to the woman who paid for my education without ever knowing it. The crowd responded with gentle laughter, assuming it was some clever line leading to a joke. Tyler looked directly toward the section where my family was seated. For a brief second, his eyes met mine. My grandmother taught me that sacrifice matters, he continued, even when the person making the sacrifice never sees where the money goes. Something tightened in my stomach. I stopped clapping. Around me, nobody seemed concerned. My son Michael smiled proudly. My daughter-in-law Vanessa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Everyone looked pleased. Everyone except me. Because I had no idea what Tyler was talking about. Paid for his education? What money? I lived carefully. My husband Frank had passed away 7 years earlier. Since then, I had stretched every dollar. My roof leaked during heavy rain. My sedan was nearly 15 years old. Last winter, I delayed replacing my furnace because the estimate was almost $6,000. There was no secret college fund, no hidden fortune, no extra account quietly paying tuition. Tyler finished his speech to a standing ovation. People cheered. Caps flew into the air. Music filled the stadium. Yet I barely heard any of it. My eyes remained fixed on my grandson as he stepped away from the podium. He looked relieved, almost nervous, as if he had finally said something he had been carrying for a long time. An hour later, while families gathered on the field for photographs, I watched Tyler laugh with friends and pose beside his parents. Vanessa kept glancing in my direction. Michael avoided eye contact entirely. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. But as I stood there holding a bouquet of blue and white flowers, one question refused to leave my mind. If I had paid for Tyler's future, why was this the first time I had ever heard about it? The drive home took almost 40 minutes, but I barely noticed the traffic. Tyler's words replayed in my mind over and over, each time sounding stranger than before. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the celebration felt far away, like something I had watched happen to someone else. My small white house sat exactly as I had left it that morning. The flower bed needed weeding. The porch light flickered occasionally because I had never gotten around to replacing the fixture. Everything about the place reflected the reality of my finances. Careful choices, delayed repairs, constant budgeting. I carried the graduation program inside and set it on the kitchen table. The silence felt heavy. 7 years earlier, Frank would have been sitting at that table waiting to hear every detail about Tyler's speech. He always believed family stories deserved to be told twice. Once when they happened and again over coffee afterward. I filled the kettle and stood by the sink while the water heated. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the backyard. The old maple tree Frank planted 30 years ago cast long shadows over the grass. Looking at it usually brought comfort. That day it brought questions. After pouring my coffee, I opened the drawer where I kept household bills, electric statements, insurance notices, property tax reminders. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested hidden wealth or secret accounts. For years I had lived exactly as I believed I needed to live. Every expense was planned, every purchase considered carefully. Last month, I spent 3 days deciding whether I could afford a new refrigerator after the old one started making strange noises. People who quietly funded college educations did not spend 3 days worrying about appliances. Around 6 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa appeared on the screen. "Thank you for coming today. Tyler was so happy you were there." Attached was a family photograph from the field. Tyler stood in the center wearing his graduation gown. Michael had one arm around him. Vanessa smiled brightly beside them. I stared at the picture for several seconds before setting the phone face down. Something about the message felt too polished, too careful. 10 minutes later, another text arrived, this one from Michael. "Great day. Love you, Mom. We should get together soon." That was unusual. My son loved me, but he was not the type to send emotional messages. Most of our conversations involved practical things. Weather, work, holiday plans. Seeing those words now only deepened my unease. I opened the photograph again and zoomed in. Tyler looked genuinely happy. Michael looked tired. Vanessa looked perfect. Then I noticed something I had missed before. Tyler was holding a folded document in his hand. Just a corner was visible beneath the diploma cover. It could have been anything. A speech outline, a schedule, a program. Yet for some reason my eyes stayed fixed on it. The same instinct that once helped me guide students through crowded library shelves whispered that something important was hiding in plain sight. I finished my coffee cold. Then I reached for my phone and opened Tyler's graduation speech livestream. If I was going to understand what he meant, I needed to hear every word again. The livestream recording was still available on the school website. I sat alone at my kitchen table and watched the entire ceremony again from the beginning. The second time felt different. Instead of seeing a proud grandmother celebrating her grandson, I felt like an investigator searching for a detail everyone else had missed. Tyler appeared relaxed when he walked onto the stage. He smiled at his classmates. He joked with the principal. Nothing seemed unusual. Then his speech began. I listened carefully to every sentence, every pause, every glance. The line about paying for his education sounded even stranger the second time. But what caught my attention was not the sentence itself. It was what happened immediately afterward. For less than a second, the camera shifted toward the audience. Most people would never notice it. The movement was brief. Yet during that moment, Vanessa's expression changed completely. Her smile disappeared. Her shoulders stiffened. She looked toward Michael. Michael looked down at the ground. Then the camera returned to Tyler, and both expressions vanished. I replayed that section 3 times. Then 5. The reaction was real. Something in Tyler's speech had unsettled them. Around 8 o'clock that evening, Tyler called. His voice sounded cheerful at first. We talked about graduation, his friends, his plans for the summer. Eventually, I mentioned the speech. There was a pause, a small one, but I heard it. "Everyone loved it," he said. "You always were a great speaker," I replied. There was one part one did not quite understand. Another pause, longer this time. "Which part?" he asked. "The part about someone paying for your education without knowing it." Silence. Not confusion. Not surprise. Silence. Then Tyler laughed softly. "Oh, that." I waited. "What did you mean?" I asked. "I probably explained it badly," he said quickly. "Do not worry about it, Grandma." The answer felt rehearsed. Tyler had never been vague with me. As a child, he explained everything. Every science project. Every baseball game. Every dream for the future. Suddenly, he did not want to explain a single sentence. We ended the call a few minutes later. Afterward, I sat staring at my phone. Something was wrong. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just wrong. The next morning, I followed my normal routine. Coffee. Toast. The newspaper. Yet my attention drifted constantly. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to clean the hall closet. It was something productive to do while I sorted through my thoughts. Halfway through organizing old boxes, I found a folder labeled Frank. My late husband's handwriting was unmistakable. Neat. Precise. Familiar enough to make my chest ache. I carried the folder to the dining table and opened it carefully. Inside were insurance records, tax documents, and several letters. Most contained information I already knew. Then I discovered an envelope tucked between 2 files. It had never been opened. My name was written on the front. The postmark date was from nearly 4 years earlier. I stared at it for several seconds. I had never seen it before. Somehow a letter addressed to me had ended up buried inside Frank's records. My pulse quickened as I slid my finger beneath the seal. Whatever questions had begun at Tyler's graduation suddenly felt much larger than a single speech. The paper inside the envelope was only a single page, but by the time I finished reading it, my hands were trembling. It was a notice from an investment management firm I had never heard of before. The letter thanked me for attending a beneficiary review meeting and referenced documents that had supposedly been discussed during an appointment. The problem was simple. I had never attended any meeting. I had never even heard of the company. I checked the date again. For years earlier. Nearly 3 years after Frank had passed away. The letter was addressed to me by name and listed my correct home address. There was no possibility that it belonged to someone else. I sat down slowly and read every line a second time. Then a third. The wording was formal and vague, but one phrase stood out. Primary beneficiary review. I stared at those words until they blurred. Beneficiary of what? Frank had always handled investments during our marriage, but he never kept secrets from me. If there had been something important, he would have told me. Or at least I had always believed he would. I searched the folder again. Hidden beneath several tax records, I found another document. This one was only a photocopy. Most of the text had been cut off, but a partial account number remained visible near the top. Beneath it was a handwritten note in Frank's familiar script. Call if anything changes. The note was dated 6 months before his death. Suddenly, memories I had ignored for years began resurfacing. After Frank passed away, Michael had insisted on helping me organize the paperwork. At the time, I appreciated it. I was grieving, exhausted, overwhelmed by forms and legal documents. Vanessa had helped too. She brought binders, labels, storage boxes. She repeatedly assured me that everything important had already been reviewed by professionals. I remembered trusting her completely. Now that memory felt different. Around noon, I called the phone number listed on the old letter. I expected it to be disconnected. Instead, a receptionist answered immediately. I introduced myself and explained why I was calling. There was a brief pause. Then she transferred me to another department. The representative who answered sounded polite but cautious. After verifying my identity, she searched for my records. I listened to the clicking of keys on a keyboard. Then silence. Long silence. Mrs. Brooks? The woman finally said. Yes. According to our system, you attended a beneficiary review meeting approximately 4 years ago. I gripped the edge of the table. I did not. Another pause followed. That is unusual. Can you tell me what account was being reviewed? The woman hesitated. I am sorry. I cannot release details over the phone without additional verification. My heart sank. Then she added something unexpected. However, I can confirm that the account remains active. Active. One word. That was all. Yet it changed everything. The account existed. The meeting existed. Documents existed. Somewhere between Frank's death and Tyler's graduation, a piece of my life had vanished without my knowledge. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether that disappearance had been an accident at all. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words active account flashing through my mind. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I was done guessing. If someone had moved pieces of my life around without my knowledge, I wanted facts, not theories. The following morning, I drove downtown to the investment firm's office. The building occupied 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the river. It looked far more expensive than any place I would normally visit. I carried the old letter in my purse and walked through the revolving doors with a confidence I did not entirely feel. After checking in at reception, I was escorted to a conference room. A young advisor named Kevin entered with a laptop and several folders. He greeted me politely and reviewed my identification again. Then he began searching their records. At first, everything moved slowly. He asked routine questions. I answered them. Occasionally, his expression tightened as he read something on the screen. Finally, he looked up. Mrs. Brooks, I believe there may be some inconsistencies in this file. My pulse quickened. What kind of inconsistencies? He hesitated. According to our records, you attended a beneficiary meeting 4 years ago and signed multiple documents. I never attended any meeting, I said, and I never signed anything. Kevin frowned. He turned the screen slightly toward me. There, attached to a digital record, was a signature. My name appeared beneath it. Eleanor Brooks. At first glance, it looked convincing. Then I noticed a mistake. A small one, but unmistakable. The signature included a flourish beneath the final letter of my last name. I had never signed my name that way. Not once in my life. I pointed at the screen. That is not my signature. Kevin became very quiet. He enlarged the document. Then another. Then another. The same signature appeared repeatedly. Do you recognize any of the witnesses listed here? He asked. I scanned the names. One stood out immediately. Vanessa Brooks. I felt the room grow colder. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Kevin cleared his throat. I cannot make legal conclusions, but I can confirm she was present during at least one of the documented meetings. Present. Notified. Involved. Until that moment, I had been trying not to jump to conclusions. I wanted innocent explanations, misunderstandings, clerical errors. Yet seeing Vanessa's name attached to documents I had never seen changed something inside me. Before leaving, I requested copies of everything legally available. Kevin promised to submit the request immediately. As I stood to leave, he said one final thing. There is another detail you should know. I turned back toward him. The account was originally established by your husband. I nodded. That part did not surprise me. Then he continued. However, the beneficiary designation was modified approximately 4 years ago. Modified. The word landed harder than I expected. Someone had changed something. Someone had benefited from that change. And for the first time, I was no longer asking whether a secret existed. I was asking who had been hiding it from me all these years. The copies arrived 3 days later in a thick envelope that felt heavier than paper should. I carried it into my kitchen, set it beside a cup of coffee, and stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Part of me still hoped there was a reasonable explanation waiting inside. Some harmless administrative mistake. A misunderstanding that would make me feel foolish for worrying. Instead, the first document I read erased that hope completely. It was a change of beneficiary form. The account had originally listed me as the primary beneficiary. My name appeared clearly in the older records. There was no ambiguity, no confusion. Frank had intended the account for me. Then, 4 years ago, the designation changed. My name disappeared. A different beneficiary was added. I turned the page and felt my stomach drop. The new beneficiary was not Vanessa. It was not Michael. It was Tyler. I blinked several times, certain I had misunderstood something. Tyler had been only 14 years old at the time. A child. Why would anyone secretly move assets into an account connected to a teenager? The answer came 2 pages later. A custodial manager had been assigned to oversee everything until Tyler reached adulthood. The custodial manager was Vanessa Brooks. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Suddenly, the pieces began shifting into place. Not enough to reveal the full picture, but enough to expose the outline. The money had not vanished. It had been redirected. Legally, perhaps. Ethically, I was no longer sure. I spent the afternoon reading every page. Some records referenced annual withdrawals. Others mentioned educational expenses. Yet the amounts did not make sense. Several transactions were far larger than any school-related costs a teenager would normally generate. One withdrawal alone exceeded $30,000. Another was even larger. I made notes on a yellow legal pad until the paper filled with question marks and account numbers. Around 5 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Michael. His voice sounded tired. He asked how I was doing. Asked whether I enjoyed the graduation ceremony. Asked whether I needed anything. The conversation felt strangely careful, as if he were testing the ground beneath each sentence before speaking. Then he mentioned Tyler. He has been spending a lot of time thinking about college lately, he said. I imagine so, I replied. College is expensive. Silence followed. Brief. Uncomfortable. Well, Michael said. Fortunately, some things were planned ahead. My heart skipped a beat. There it was again. Another sentence that seemed ordinary on the surface, but carried hidden weight underneath. I wanted to confront him immediately. I wanted to ask about the account, the signatures, the beneficiary change. Instead, I said nothing. The conversation ended a few minutes later. That evening, I reviewed the documents one final time. Near the bottom of a transaction summary, I noticed a name attached to one of the approvals. It was not Vanessa. It was not Michael. It belonged to a retired accountant named Harold Mercer. The name meant nothing to me. Yet beside it was a phone number. I stared at that number for a long time. Something told me that before this story was over, Harold Mercer would answer questions that nobody in my family wanted me to ask. The next morning, I called the number listed beside Harold Mercer's name. I expected a disconnected line or a brief conversation. Instead, a calm, elderly voice answered on the second ring. When I introduced myself, The silence that followed lasted several seconds. "Mrs. Brooks," he finally said, "I wondered if I would hear from you someday." Those words immediately put me on edge. People do not say things like that unless they know more than they are supposed to. Harold agreed to meet me that afternoon at a small diner on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that served coffee in thick ceramic mugs and still had photographs of local high school football teams hanging on the walls. When I arrived, he was already seated in a corner booth. He looked to be in his late 70s, neatly dressed, alert eyes, the sort of man who noticed details. After a few minutes of polite conversation, I placed copies of the account documents on the table. Harold studied them without surprise. "You recognize these?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes." "Then perhaps you can explain why my husband's account was changed without my knowledge." Harold folded his hands. For a moment, he seemed reluctant to speak. Then he sighed. "The account itself was never the real issue." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He glanced around the diner before lowering his voice. "Frank was worried during the last year of his life. Not about money. About control." The statement caught me completely off guard. Frank had always appeared confident and organized. I had never seen fear in him. Harold continued. "Your husband believed certain people might influence financial decisions after he was gone. He wanted protections in place." My pulse quickened. "What kind of protections?" Harold reached into a worn leather briefcase and removed a thin folder. Inside were photocopies of correspondence between him and Frank. I immediately recognized my husband's handwriting. Seeing it again felt like hearing a familiar voice after years of silence. One letter stopped me cold. In it, Frank discussed creating safeguards to ensure family assets remained available for future generations. Another line stood out even more. "If anything changes unexpectedly, Eleanor must be informed immediately." I read the sentence twice, then 3 times. "I was never informed," I said quietly. Harold nodded. "I know." A heavy silence settled between us. "Why not?" I asked. Harold looked genuinely troubled. "Because shortly after Frank passed away, I was informed that all communication should go through the family representative." "Vanessa," I said. It was not a question. Harold's expression answered it for him. My stomach tightened. For years I had assumed Vanessa was simply organized and helpful. The person who volunteered to manage paperwork when everyone else felt overwhelmed. Now those same actions looked different. Not criminal. Not dramatic. Just carefully positioned. Carefully controlled. Before we left, Harold handed me one final document. It was a meeting summary from several years earlier. Most of it seemed routine until I reached the final paragraph. There, buried near the bottom, was a reference to a secondary asset connected to the original account. Not cash. Not investments. Real estate. Significant real estate. I stared at the page while a new question formed in my mind. If the account had only been part of the story, what exactly had Tyler unknowingly exposed during that graduation speech? For the next 2 days, I carried Harold's documents everywhere. They sat beside my coffee cup in the morning, beside my chair in the evening, and beside my bed at night. The more I read them, the more one fact stood out. Frank had not been trying to hide assets from me. He had been trying to protect them for me. That realization changed everything. Until then, I had assumed the story was about money. Now I began to suspect it was really about access. Access to information. Access to decisions. Access to the truth. On the 3rd morning, my phone rang unexpectedly. Tyler's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. His voice sounded different. Less confident than usual. "Grandma, can I stop by?" he asked. Of course. An hour later, he arrived carrying a backpack. We sat at the kitchen table where I had helped him with homework for years. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. Summer plans. College orientation. Dorm life. Then Tyler grew quiet. He stared at his hands. "Grandma," he said carefully, "did my speech upset you?" I chose my words slowly. "It confused me." He nodded as though he had expected that answer. "I thought it might." Silence settled between us. I waited. Eventually Tyler reached into his backpack and removed a small flash drive. He placed it on the table between us. "I think you should have this." My heart immediately began to race. "What is it?" Tyler glanced toward the window before answering. "A few months ago, Dad asked me to organize some old digital files. Family records. Tax documents. Stuff like that." He swallowed hard. While I was sorting everything, I found emails that did not make sense. I looked down at the flash drive. What kind of emails? Messages about accounts. Property. Meetings. He paused. And your name kept appearing. My chest tightened. Did you tell your parents you found them? Tyler shook his head. No. Why not? He hesitated. Because every time I asked questions, Mom got angry. The room became very still. Tyler was not the type to exaggerate. If he said something bothered him, I listened. What made you mention it during the speech? I asked. He looked embarrassed. Honestly, I wanted someone to notice. That answer stunned me. You wanted me to notice? He nodded. I did not know what was going on. I just knew something felt wrong. Slowly, he pushed the flash drive closer to me. I thought if I said something publicly, maybe somebody would finally explain it. I stared at my grandson. For weeks I had assumed he was an accidental participant in this mystery. Now I realized he had been quietly pulling on the same loose thread. Neither of us knew where it would lead. Before leaving, Tyler stood and hugged me. At the door he stopped and turned back. There is one more thing, he said. One of the files mentioned a property downtown. My pulse quickened. What property? Tyler's expression darkened. I do not know. But whatever it is, the email said it was worth a lot more than the account everyone keeps talking about. Then he walked to his car, leaving me alone with the flash drive and a growing suspicion that the biggest secret had not even surfaced yet. That evening I plugged the flash drive into my laptop and opened the folders one by one. At first the contents seemed ordinary. Tax summaries, insurance records, property maintenance receipts. The sort of files every family accumulates over time. Then I found a folder labeled Legacy. My pulse quickened immediately. Inside were dozens of emails spanning nearly 5 years. Some were between accountants. Others involved attorneys. Several included Vanessa. A few included Michael. What surprised me most was how often my name appeared. Not as a participant, as a subject. I spent hours reading. Certain messages stood out. One discussed delaying communication until circumstances became more favorable. Another referenced beneficiary concerns. A third mentioned preserving family stability by limiting unnecessary disclosures. The language was careful, professional. Yet beneath the polished wording, I sensed something else. Information had been controlled. Decisions had been made. And somehow I had been excluded from both. Around midnight, I found the email Tyler must have noticed. It had been sent by an attorney to Vanessa nearly 3 years earlier. The subject line contained the address of a downtown commercial property. Attached was an appraisal report. I opened it and stared at the number on the final page. The property was valued at more than $12 million. I checked the figure again. Then again. Surely there had to be a mistake. Frank and I had lived comfortably, but never extravagantly. We owned our home. We saved carefully. We planned responsibly. Nothing in our lifestyle suggested ownership of a commercial asset worth that kind of money. Yet there it was. A building located in the heart of downtown Kansas City. The ownership structure appeared complicated, involving trusts and partnerships. Still, one fact remained unmistakable. Frank's name appeared throughout the documents. The deeper I looked, the stranger things became. Several emails discussed future revenue from the property, lease agreements, tax implications, long-term planning. Then I found a message that made me stop breathing for a moment. It came from Frank himself, written only months before his death. In it, he outlined his wishes regarding both the investment account and the downtown property. One sentence stood out immediately. Eleanor must remain informed regarding all significant decisions. I read the lines several times. It was direct, unambiguous, impossible to misunderstand. Yet no one had informed me of anything. Not the account, not the changes, not the property, not the revenue, nothing. At nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. The sender's name caught me completely off guard. Judge Patricia Hale. Patricia had been one of my closest friends for decades. We met while volunteering at a literacy program years earlier. Recently, we spoke only occasionally. I opened the message. It was brief. Eleanor, Harold contacted me today. We need to talk. Please call me tomorrow. There was no explanation. No details. Just that. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Harold had contacted Patricia. Patricia wanted to meet. And somehow both of them seemed to know pieces of a story I was only beginning to uncover. For the first time since Tyler's graduation, I felt certain of one thing. The truth was no longer hiding in shadows. It was moving toward me. And when it finally arrived, it was going to change everything I thought I knew about my family. I called Patricia the next morning. She answered before the first ring finished. There was no small talk. No discussion about the weather or retirement or mutual friends. "Can you meet me this afternoon?" she asked. 3 hours later, I was sitting across from her in a quiet office overlooking downtown Kansas City. Patricia had retired from the bench 2 years earlier, but she still carried herself with the same calm authority I remembered. She listened patiently while I explained everything I had discovered. The account, the beneficiary changes, the property, the emails, the flash drive. When I finished, she remained silent for several moments. Then she opened a folder she had brought with her. "There is something you need to understand," she said. "The property is far more important than the account." My stomach tightened. Patricia slid several documents across the desk. They included ownership records, corporate filings, and partnership agreements. The more I read, the more unbelievable the situation became. The downtown building was generating substantial annual income. For years, not only had the property existed, but it had continued producing revenue long after Frank's death. Revenue I had never been told about. Revenue connected to decisions I had never approved. "How much are we talking about?" I finally asked. Patricia named a figure. I stared at her in disbelief. The amount exceeded anything I had imagined. Suddenly, the missing account seemed almost insignificant by comparison. "Why would nobody tell me?" I asked quietly. Patricia gave me a look that said she already suspected the answer. "Because information is power," she replied, "and someone benefited from keeping you uninformed." As the afternoon continued, a plan began forming in my mind. For weeks I had been reacting to discoveries, following clues, reading documents, asking questions. That was about to change. I wanted answers directly from the people involved. But I also wanted honesty. And honesty rarely appears when people know they are being investigated. So I decided to do something simple. I would pretend I knew nothing. That evening I called Michael and suggested a family dinner the following weekend. He sounded surprised but pleased. Vanessa immediately agreed when he handed her the phone. Her enthusiasm felt almost excessive. By the end of the call, everyone planned to attend, including Tyler. After hanging up, I sat quietly in my living room. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I finally understood that the story was bigger than missing paperwork. Someone had spent years carefully controlling what I knew, carefully managing what information reached me, carefully shaping my understanding of my own life. For the first time since Frank died, I felt something I had not felt in years. Clarity. The family dinner was only 5 days away. Between now and then, I would gather every document, every email, and every record I could find. Then I would place the truth where it belonged, in the center of the table, and I would watch very carefully to see who looked away first. The days leading up to the dinner passed slowly. Outwardly, nothing changed. I watered my flowers, paid my bills, answered phone calls. Inside, however, everything had changed. Every document Patricia helped me organize sat neatly arranged in a binder on my dining room table. Emails, account records, property filings, meeting summaries. By Friday evening, the binder had become a timeline of decisions made without my knowledge. What surprised me most was not the paperwork itself. It was how long the pattern had continued. One omission could be explained away. Two might be coincidence. Years of omissions were something else entirely. Saturday arrived warm and clear. I spent the morning preparing dinner. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans. The same meal Frank always requested when family gathered. The familiar routine steadied my nerves. By 6 o'clock, everyone had arrived. Tyler came first. He hugged me tightly and offered to help set the table. Michael followed shortly afterward carrying a dessert tray. Vanessa entered smiling, complimenting the flowers on the porch and asking about my garden. Anyone watching would have seen an ordinary family gathering. That illusion lasted exactly 20 minutes. We sat down. Plates were filled. Conversation drifted from college plans to summer vacations. Tyler talked about orientation. Michael discussed work. Vanessa described a community event she was helping organize. I listened quietly. Occasionally I smiled. Occasionally I nodded. Nobody seemed concerned. Nobody suspected anything. Halfway through dinner, Michael mentioned how proud Frank would have been of Tyler. The room grew quieter. Frank's name always carried weight in our family. He planned carefully for the future, Michael said. That was one of his strengths. I set down my fork. Yes, I replied. He certainly did. Something in my tone caused Vanessa to glance up. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. In fact, I continued, I have spent the last few weeks learning just how carefully he planned. Silence settled across the table. Tyler lowered his glass. Michael looked confused. Vanessa's smile remained in place, though it seemed slightly strained. I stood and retrieved the binder from the sideboard. Then I returned to the table and placed it gently in the center. No dramatic gesture, no raised voice, just a binder. Yet the effect was immediate. Michael stared at it. Vanessa stopped smiling altogether. What is that? Michael asked. Answers, I said. Nobody spoke. I opened the binder and slid several documents forward. The beneficiary forms, the account records, the correspondence, the ownership documents connected to the downtown property. Michael's expression changed page by page. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became concern. Vanessa remained very still. Too still. Finally, Michael looked up. Mom, where did you get all of this? I met his eyes calmly. From the people who thought I deserved to know the truth. Across the table, Vanessa reached for a glass of water. Her hand trembled slightly. For the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain. And in that moment, I realized something important. The secrets had protected someone for years. But secrets only work when nobody is asking questions anymore. I had finally started asking. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Michael looked down at the documents again, then at Vanessa, then back at me. What exactly are you saying? He asked quietly. I slid one final document across the table. It was a copy of Frank's written instructions, the same page I had read countless times during the previous week. Michael studied it carefully. His face lost color. I never saw this, he whispered. I know, I replied. Vanessa immediately leaned forward. There has to be some misunderstanding. Her voice remained controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. Those documents are complicated. Frank wanted things handled a certain way. He did, I said calmly, which is why he specifically wrote that I was to be informed about all major decisions. Tyler stared at the papers. His eyes moved from one page to another. Then he looked directly at his parents. Did Grandma know about the property? Neither of them answered. The silence itself became an answer. Tyler's expression changed. Not anger. Disappointment. The kind that settles deeply. Michael slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Vanessa, he said quietly, tell me this is not what it looks like. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unable to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. I thought I was protecting the family. The statement hung in the air. Nobody responded. She continued. After Frank passed away, everything was chaotic. Decisions had to be made. Advisors recommended keeping certain matters centralized. One decision led to another. Then years passed. Michael stared at her. You never told Mom. It was not a question. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Across the table, Tyler sat perfectly still. I looked at my grandson and realized something important. The secret that surfaced during his graduation had accomplished what years of silence could not. It forced the truth into the open. No courtroom. No dramatic confrontation. Just facts. Documents. Conversations. Reality. After a long silence, Michael turned toward me. Mom, I am sorry. His voice cracked slightly. I should have asked more questions. I should have paid attention. I believed him. For the first time in weeks, I truly believed him. Then Tyler reached into his backpack and removed the folded speech he had carried on graduation day. He smiled sadly. I was hoping somebody would finally explain everything. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You already did more than enough. The evening ended differently than anyone expected. No shouting. No scenes. Just honesty. The following months were spent correcting records, reviewing agreements, and restoring transparency. The property remained in the family exactly as Frank intended. The account was properly documented. Every decision became visible. Most importantly, no one controlled information alone anymore. Sometimes people ask me when the truth finally came out. They assume it happened during a legal meeting or after years of investigation. The truth is much simpler. It happened because one thoughtful young man stood in front of his graduating class and spoke a sentence he believed was true. He had no idea that those words would unravel years of secrets. But they did. And every time I look at his graduation photograph, I remember that the most powerful revelations often begin with a single question nobody expected someone to ask.